Right. Let me welcome all and kick off this meeting. As you know, this is the culmination meeting of a round of webinars that we did on answering the question, the world without a WTO. Uh, Following that, we have published a discussion paper which has also been circulated for your benefit. And just to read the abstract from the same, during the first half of the 20th century, the world had witnessed some disruptions, including two large-scale wars. International trade suffered most, particularly in the run-up to and as an aftermath of the Great Depression of the early 1930s. There were no multilaterally agreed rules to arrest that decline. After almost a century, are we going to witness a similar scare? Following the Sino-American trade wars, which have been continuing over the last few years, Brexit, the US withdrawal from the TPP, and India's withdrawal from the RCEP, this question is in the mind of every right-thinking person across the world. The COVID-19 pandemic and its likely aftermath in further disrupting the existing geopolitical and geoeconomic equilibrium, however imperfect they might be, along with the largely dysfunctional World Trade Organization, which is unable to discharge one of its most important functions, the dispute settlement, the world is likely to witness many more trade-related disruptions. Recent export restrictions on essential medicines and other medical equipment and food items by many countries provide some directions towards an emerging beggar thy neighbor world. Can humanity afford such a disruptive world? While a simple answer is no, and there is hardly any effort on the parts of global leaders, there are no statesmen. To stem this rot, the onus for reviving the multilateral trading system lies equally with the global trade community at large. That calls for the only multilateralism to survive on the ongoing onslaught against it, but also, and more importantly, under a new normal of polylateralism, an idea which is floated by Pascal in this webinar series, where governments, businesses, and civil society work together in a structured manner. A rules-based multilateral system is an absolute necessity for this to happen in a balanced and equitable manner. This is because there is no denying the fact that it is this system that underlines peace, security, stability, and prosperity in the post-war world. Therefore, other than providing a historical narrative of the multilateral trading system under the GATT and its successor, the WTO, the discussion paper analyzes a forward-looking agenda for the multilateral trading system to reinvent itself in a new avatar. This agenda is based on, as I said, a series of webinars organized by us, held across the world during April to September 2020. It concludes by arguing that while different systems of economic and political governance can coexist, it is important for the global powers to understand the value of agreeing to disagree. And it is the responsibility of the middle and emerging powers to convince them about this. With that, let me welcome you all once again and hand over the discussions to Pascal for his response.
Thanks a lot. For whatever reason, I've lost a number of pictures, but that's life. I can see you. So if I say stupid things, I'll have to detect this on your body language. So let me start this conversation just by congratulating Koch for having collected such rich material with very different views, with seminars on different continents, which I think give us a pretty large, comprehensive picture of the problem you wanted to highlight, and which is whether or not this world can live without a World Trade Organization. WTO being a sort of a proxy for what we trademarks call the RBMTS, which is a bit of a longer acronym than World Trade Organization. RBMTS meaning rules-based multilateral trading system. I think you've produced a piece which pretty convincingly argues that in reality, TNA, to pursue with acronyms, there is no alternative, and that other systems of organizing trade relations between nations or not organizing trade relations between nations are all alternatives which are worse, more costly, more dangerous, more unequal, more unbalanced, more unfair than what we have, although recognizing that what we have is far from perfect, as evidenced in this recent COVID crisis, which for some of us is past, and I'm thinking of part of Asia, and for many of us is still in the making, unfortunately, and this is true for roughly the rest of the world, but China and a few bright spots like Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, Korea, or French Caledonia in the Pacific. So thanks for having done that. I will just put a few things on the table so that we can start our dialogue. It's one thing saying we need a rules-based multilateral system. In other words, a WTO, which is a rule book on one side, and a machinery to make sure that this rules books is implemented, whether through monitoring, peer review, expertise from the Secretariat, or whether through enforcement such as the dispute settlement system. That's one thing. The next question, and this of course is also part of the developments which you've devoted in your final piece. Another thing is to make sure that the system is up to its task, which for the moment, frankly speaking, is not the case. And this takes us to WTO reform, which is the code name for improving the multilateral trading system we have. And I see that developing in two directions. And my main point of this first comment, Pradeep, would be that you've only addressed the first part of the equation, whereas I believe there are two parts of this equation. WTO reforms, in my view, is both an issue of software and an issue of hardware. Software is the rule book, the principles, the agreements, the way we deal multilaterally with obstacles to trade. And there's quite a lot of items on the to-do list, but there's also a hardware issue, which I insist on, and I'm probably the only one on this planet to insist so heavily in this, and maybe because I was a DG of WTO during 8 years, which is the way this organization works. And my point, and I'll stop there, this first reaction to what you've put on the table, the hardware issue is not properly highlighted, it's not properly diagnosed, it's not properly addressed a fortiori, and there is a big task to make sure that this organization works, whereas for the moment, the working of the system is not all right. And in a nutshell, and I can enter into more details if necessary. In a nutshell, I believe, and this will not surprise some of you around this digital table, member states have too much of a say, and the Secretariat has too little of a say. In other words, WTO is still too much of an organization and not yet enough of an institution. That's my first reaction to what you've tabled, Pradeep.
With that, thank you very much, Pascal, for these opening remarks. And indeed, the point which you made towards the end, in the context of the not enough attention having been paid to the hardware, it'll be interesting to hear from Alejandro, who had also participated in the webinar, one of the first webinars, as to what would his response be in terms of the question that you raised in terms of hardware. Alejandro?
Thank you very much, and hello, Pascal. Very interesting exercise that you have undertaken throughout these months. Very useful, by the way. And I would just like to underscore what Pascal just said, just to give by way of an example something which strikes me. One frequently heard criticism of the WTO from many members is the lack of transparency. And the first thing that comes to mind is because countries don't always notify. When they do, sometimes it's late, and certainly almost always incomplete. Having said that, when one looks at what should be notified, the language in the text is sometimes very vague. But in any case, we're talking here about an instrument to achieve transparency, which is technology of the 1950s. When today, because of Pascal's initiative during the financial crisis, the Secretariat undertook to illustrate, to inform government by collecting the relevant information about the trade measures, whether restrictive, liberalizing, that was being applied worldwide. And, you know, there's a lot that the Secretariat can do in terms of providing members with better information, well organized so that it can be useful, and thus achieving the ultimate objective of transparency, which is at the basis of any minimum trust within the organization. So it's not that Secretariat could do the job of members, but certainly the Secretariat could do it and probably should do more. And, you know, the technology is there. So it amazes me at the discussion, which is relying on the realities of 1947 and not of present times. Thanks.
Thank you very much. May I request Hamid?
Okay, I would respond to what Pascal said by a big nod and agreement, because I think even when we work together, we come from a time where the Secretariat used to play an important role. This mantra about the WTO being member-driven, I think, is a reality, and members always have the ultimate authority. But the Secretariat always had a very important role to play as a unique repository of world-class expertise that can provide the right analysis, collect information, and provide a backdrop for useful discussions. But this needs to be approved by the membership. Is there a lot to do? Absolutely. And as Alejandro said, technologies now provide tools that were not available before that can provide additional inputs from the Secretariat while maintaining, of course, the neutrality and impartiality of the Secretariat. But the point I want to stress here is that while this is definitely something that has to be agreed by the membership, it's also something that requires some kind of a tone setting by the head of the Secretariat. I remember when Pascal was there, the tone was set, but then that was not the situation afterwards. I don't mean to point fingers at anybody, but it is something that should be also considered as we go forward. Now, that's my response to Pascal's point about the software and the hardware, and I completely agree with that. The only thing that I would add here is that when we look at WTO reform, I would always suggest that we take this as a holistic vision in which we place the different parts, because a lot of the discussions that I have participated in so far has been taking bits and pieces, but we need to have a conceptual framework. And I think from what I heard so far and from your introduction, Pradeep, I would definitely congratulate you on this sort of sound conceptual approach that you're taking. So back to you.
Thank you very much, Hamid. May I request Raiko? Raiko?
Hello, how are you?
Very good.
Thank you for the opportunity to comment. I didn't realize I was going to be given an opportunity to say anything. I was very keen to listen to you, and Mr. Pascal and everybody speaking. As you know, I'm not an expert on international economics or trade. I'm a competition authority. But I would like to say it's very encouraging that you and everybody, the distinguished panelists are talking about this. And as an economist, I've been very concerned where WTO is seem to be heading or lost its way. And I'm very keen to hear what people have to say, and maybe from the competition authority point of view, what I could add. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I request Dr. Didar Singh?
Pradeep ji, I would like to only compliment all of you for actually raising this issue. It's a politically sensitive issue to raise in terms of the role of WTO and also the fact of the reforms that are needed there. I agree with the discussion as it is happening, but basically want to point out that WTO is nothing but one more organization in the global context of the global trading system that we set up and the global political system that was set up 70 years ago. That is now at question. It is being looked at, it is being reviewed, and we are seeing a whole historical questioning of everything that has happened in the past 70 years. So please bear this in mind when we look at any context of reform and any context of changes in the system that we are talking about. Thank you.
Let me pick up the point made by Dr. Didar Singh. He is a former administrative service officer in India, and he used to be Secretary General of FICCI, one of our leading business chambers, and is now a distinguished fellow at CUTS. The question which he raised is something where you had also participated in another webinar we had done on multilateralism. And in the context of the Joe Biden regime, likely Joe Biden regime, because Trump has still not given up. And one hears all kinds of stories. But is there a light at the end of the tunnel with the new regime in the US, if the new regime comes in? Or if the old regime continues, what would happen?
I'll start from the previous point made by Dr. Didar Singh, which is that this issue of what about WTO has now come to the fore of an international and even in some cases of a national conversation. And I think the root of this sort of new visibility, which you address in your piece, come from two different developments that have taken place for the last 20 years. The first one is bad news, which is that the World Trade Organization has not succeeded in those last 20 years to update the WTO rulebook in order to factor in changes which have taken place in the world economy, and in particular in the area of obstacle to trade, which is the real issue. I mean, a rules-based multilateral trading system means addressing obstacle to trade, reducing them, getting rid of them in a rules fair, balanced way in order to open trade. So bad news is that the capacity of the system to adjust to new reality has not delivered. We still live with rules of global trade that date from the mid-90s. And whether it's about climate, whether it's about data, whether it's about subsidies, there is an obvious discrepancy between the historical context in which those rules were put together and the reality of today's world. That's the bad news. First development. Second development is the good news, which is that we have been living for the last 4 years with a US president who decided to kill the WTO. As surprising as it may be, given the major role which the US have played in setting up the system, in building up, Donald Trump was elected on a protectionist platform. It was the first time since 1900 any US president was elected on a protectionist platform. And he did, or tried to do, what he said he would do, i.e. America first, and switch from a rules-based system to an arm-twisting system. Now, the good news is that he did not succeed. There may be bad reasons for which it did not succeed, which is that the system is a bit like like a pillar. It's not very solid. It's a bit softy. So punching on a pillar usually doesn't give a lot of results. But there are good reasons for which he did not succeed, which is that for a vast majority of countries on this planet, the Trump way was the wrong way. And I think this part of good news is also one of the reasons why now we are talking about the reform of the WTO, which I think is a higher topic than before. And I'm glad about this because we need it. And in a way, I think the Trump tunnel for the WTO is a lesson that tells us that there is an end to this tunnel. And to answer your question, although we have to wait until January to have a more detailed view of what the Biden administration agenda is about international trade, I know for sure from the contacts I have, and everybody will understand that I have more friends around Biden than I had friends around Trump. This is no surprise for anybody, I hope. What I know is that at least the intention of the new US administration is to go back to the WTO table. I don't think a series of problems with the US have with the existing system, starting with the conditions of competition with China in open trade will disappear. And by the way, as you know, and I've said that publicly many times, I share part of these concerns. So the problems will not evaporate, but we will have a way to tackle them, to discuss them, to address them, to negotiate them, which is different than using the WTO as a punching ball, even if this punching ball, as I said, has reasonably resisted during these 4 years.
If anybody else has any issue to be raised, they are welcome. Yeah, Hamid.
Thank you, Pradeep. And I agree again with what Pascal was just saying about the tendency of the new administration to be more inclined towards the WTO and multilateralism in general, not just in the trade field. But a question to Pascal, perhaps, at this particular time in the process, because until we have a new USTR, it's not going to be until spring. In the meantime, do you see that there may be some useful efforts that those who care about the system, those who are the friends of the system, starting with the EU and others, is there something that can be done in the meantime to start encouraging the new administration to be forthcoming instead of sitting and waiting to see what will come from Washington by next spring, and therefore be just purely reactive? I mean, what useful things can be done now? That's my practical question.
Let me answer this in sort of two short points. First, there is in the WTO an ongoing negotiation which has accelerated in recent times about WTO disciplines on fish subsidies. Now, I know it's an issue on which India is not that enthusiastic, or at least India would accept disciplines in the WTO that would bite in non-Indian fishery subsidies, but as little as possible on Indian fishery subsidies, which I will be told is a sort of normal Westphalian behavior. But I'm mentioning this point, which has not attracted a lot of public attention, because there is, for the first time since a long time, a reasonable probability of finishing a negotiation in the WTO that has been going on for a long time. And I think doing this now, at a time where a US administration is reconsidering its relationship with the WTO, but knowing that because this did not get the attention of Trump, it was reasonably safely managed, the US have been in favor of stock discipline for a long time. So I'm putting the sort of one penny in the machine that showing to the US that you can do something in WTO in an area where the US has been pushing for getting something done would be a sort of good appetizer. It will not be a profound reform of WTO, and we clearly need more than that. So that's my first short-term little thing, but which might change the ambience. Second is, of course, that in the meantime, we need to make sure that the necessary contacts are taking place between the incoming administration, the EU, and China. This remains, in my view, the fundamental triangle for progress in the WTO, not least because of the big bearing of the US-China geopolitical, geoeconomic, geostrategic, geotechnological rivalry, which is here to stay. And we need to find within this rivalry, we need to find a sort of bridge that addresses the problems with the US have with China and the problems which China have with the US through the sort of mediation of the European Union, who has, let's say, consideration for both sides, and who, in the area of trade, is the sort of brokering entity which we need. And I think this has shown in recent years, including when the EU was asked to set up this dispute settlement system, which is apart from the official one, but which allows for a number of disputes to keep moving with the countries that have decided to join this sort of provisional dispute settlement system. So my second answer to Hamid is that in the meantime, EU and China should deploy the necessary contact with the transition team on the Biden side, so that the major issue which will have to be dealt with, and which is a recognition by China that we need more of what they call competitive neutrality in international trade, i.e. disciplines on what we Europeans call state aids, is advanced. Whether China is or not ready to do that, I don't know. I'm sure China would not have done that with a Trump president of the US because they hate losing the face, and they like cooking deals, which give the impression that you're not paying, but the other one is paying, which is what the Chinese have done very cleverly in this sort of so-called first phase agreement with the Trump administration. So I think we need to convince the Chinese that they have to move on this. And I think a joint, non-aggressive US-EU pressure in the name of we need more disciplines on state aid if we want not only to keep opening trade with China, but to keep trade open with China is the urgency. And of course, contacts should be taken, in my view, in this direction. We, as you know, don't have yet a DG of WTO that would be able to discreetly, behind the scene, if not organize, at least be part of this contact as a sort of trustee by the players, and this is in a way regrettable. That would be my answer to your question, Hamid.
Thank you, Pascal. I notice there's Toralf here. Toralf?
Thank you, Pradeep, for inviting me. I'm on from Norway, Oslo, Norway. I have a few observations, and one in particular referring to, first of all, the WTO's belonging into a family of multilateral regimes related to Trump's election victory and almost repeating victory on the back of frustrated workers in the United States. They claim, and he on their behalf claim, that the competition under the auspices of the WTO is unfair to American workers, and one might ask, to workers in developed countries in general. Do they have a point? And if so, what needs to be done? Thank you.
They have a point, and we all in the Western world, and I put EU in this category, as well as Norway, we all have had problems in adjusting to the rapid, much more rapid than was expected, penetration of China in the world economy. We have registered huge benefits from that. Remember, when China joined WTO, its external trade surplus was 10% of its GNP. 20 years later, its external trade surplus is 1% of its GNP. And what they say is that this melting of 9% of the GNP of China, which is now a huge quantity, shows that imports into China have grown more rapidly than exports of China to the rest of the world. This is the macro picture. Now, of course, like always in opening trade, which, as often said, works according to a Ricardo Schumpeterian model, it's efficient because it's painful, and it's painful because it is efficient. And of course, the pain is, in many cases, not properly distributed among the actors of the system. And American workers, like European workers, have been hit by a competition in areas where China was using its main comparative advantage at the time, which was a low cost of labor, which led to either displacing production or importing goods that were not produced anymore where they used to be produced before. Nothing surprising on this. The experience shows that this reality has been addressed more or less well, depending on countries. I've often taken the example of the end of the multi-fiber agreement in the late 90s and beginning of the years 2000. And if I take this example, and notably in the case of Europe, it was the same trade regime for all EU members. They got the same opening of the textile and clothing trade regime. Some of them suffered a lot, countries like Portugal, like Italy, for instance. Others did not, like Sweden or Finland or Denmark. The South suffered, the North did not. And the real reason behind this is that countries in the northern part of Europe were better prepared. They had prepared strategies for that. They have social security systems or systems to reduce social insecurity, which are thicker than elsewhere. Their adjustment has been better. So in the case of the US, and I'm finishing to answer your question, yes, workers in the old industry in the US, in the old part of the economy, which is, by the way, where there is the largest rate of unionization, because the US legislation is such that you can unionize relatively easily in the old economy and much more difficulty in the new economy, been hit, but this is largely a problem that has to do with the low capacity of the US system, and notably of the US welfare system, to deal with this sort of shock. I think the lesson to be drawn from this experience is not that we should not open trade. We should not renounce to the efficiencies it creates, because at the end of the day, this is growth and welfare, and notably for poorer countries and poorer people. But we should look at the other side of the problem, which is how to better cope with these transformations, which, as we all know, go together with other major transformations, which trade opening sometimes fosters, such as technological change, such as digitalization, which are issues which are as big on an agenda to adjust our workforce in a socially fair way than just trade opening.
Thank you very much, Pascal. With that, we come to an end of this conversation. You have to go for your next meeting. And may I request Vipul Chatterjee, my colleague, to propose a vote of thanks and share his own views. Vipul?
I would just pick up one point from Mr. Lamy's thoughts. There is no alternative. Absolutely, there is no alternative to the WTO. We all understand that. But at the same time, we don't do anything. We don't do much. So that is the larger political question that I would like to pose. So let me propose, other than proposing the vote of thanks, just two loud thoughts. One is that let there be, Mr. Lamy and many others experts have been talking about these WTO reforms. So let me propose that let there be an eminent persons group, and by eminent persons, I mean all living WTO DGs who have been retired. Let them come out with this conceptual framework for software as well as hardware reforms in the WTO system. And my second point is, while I'm sure that they are going to come out with a very good package of proposals and that will be debated, but that has to be taken at the political level. And there I don't know. We need a number of Mr. Keynes. I don't see one Mr. Keynes in today's world. So maybe we can have another group of having politicians like Mr. Verma, Dr. Manmohan Singh, and people like them. These are some couple of names which are coming to my mind loudly. So maybe the time has come to think along those lines. So with that, let me thank all of you And we're going to send this discussion paper all over the world. And I'm sure that that will raise further debates on this subject. Thank you very much.
And thanks very much, Pradeep, for organizing this and inviting me.
Thank you very much.
So, good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and I can think of the three looking at this screen. Bye, Pradeep, and thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.
As we say in Hindi, we say namaskar at any time of the day, whether you welcome somebody or you wish goodbye to somebody.
Absolutely.
It's a very universal sign of greeting, and particularly in the current pandemic days, we stop shaking hands also. Thank you very much.